So we continue with this story of examining attitudes and looking at what they're based on, you know. And the question is, are your attitudes founded in reality, or are they based on something that you learned before you were old enough to reason? Something that you learned from culture, the society that you were raised in, something that you learned from your parents. I prefer mine to be based on facts and data and the truth. It's as simple as that. So here's another one that a lot of people get wrong, and yet it's a deeply ingrained attitude, and that is that most addicts are dependent on society. They are people who don't contribute. They're wastrels, bums, etc. Take a survey of the addicted population, the alcoholic population, and what you find is that 65% are currently employed. 65% went to work today. Some of them did an excellent job. Some of them did a really fine job today and were commended by their employers. They are so-called functioning alcoholics. I mean, hell, Buzz Aldrin went to work. He walked on the moon. He had the right stuff, and yet he was alcoholic. So the notion that they're wastrels who do not, contribute, it flies in the face of the fact that Benjamin Pierce died of cirrhosis of the liver. Was he the 14th president of the United States? And there are all kinds of alcoholics who are doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs, and the range is amazing. In fact, most of you look like alcoholics to me. I always assume everybody in the audience is an alcoholic because you look like them. You look like them. They look like people. And so, yeah, a portion of them will have gone to work today. Now we're going to go backward a little bit. In Multnomah County in Oregon, the sheriff's office there has been collecting pictures, we were talking about methamphetamine, of meth addicts that are before and afters to illustrate the damage that meth has on the human face. I call meth the ugly drug because it causes people to scratch their skin and it's scarred, and their cheeks sink and they lose weight. Well, let me let the picture show you. Some of these pictures, of course, were before and afters, sometimes over years, several years, sometimes just a few months. So it depends on the severity of it. That's the same person. So is that. Kind of interesting, and yet, there's some people, it's a powerfully addictive drug. And despite the consequences, you can imagine that anyone who is that dramatically changed over from months to years, that process can't be explained as a matter of choice. That behavior has to be driven by compulsion, by some desire to feel the impact of that drug that is more powerful than the consequences. I can't explain it. No one wants to make themselves ugly, all right? So why did they become ugly? Because they chose to use the drug? Or because despite consequences, there is a force at work that drives the use of that drug. And that force is what we call addiction. It can persist despite God knows what. Near death experience. I knew a teenager, 17 years old, arrested twice. In other words, they delivered him to the hospital, he was dead. I asked him, were you dead? And he said, no, I just arrested. I said, shit, Tim, that's dead. That's called dead. Your heart was not beating. Didn't stop him. Left the hospital, using again. That's got to be a powerful force. And Tim isn't stupid. And those people aren't stupid. I think we make a terrible mistake of, we sort of diminish them in the interest of saving ourselves. So addiction itself, what is it? I will bet that most of you walk in here with one of several incorrect notions. One is that addiction is tied to physical dependence. In other words, we won't wait to call you an addict until you get the shakes, or if you've been using a stimulant, you stop using it and you crash. That's not true. Addiction does not require physical dependence. It's a primary disease. It's not a symptom of a moral problem. It's not indicative that the person who has it is a moral collapse, a moral failure, has no courage, has no stamina. Okay, it's not a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. In fact, the majority of addicts, once sober, are not diagnosable with a psychiatric disorder. So if you're calling it a psychiatric disorder, you almost have to be able to prove that the majority of addicts get magically, mentally well with just abstinence. It's called spontaneous remission. It's like saying 10 of these people had cancer, 5 of them just had to go away. How? Just went away. Spontaneous remission. That's bullshit. That's just bullshit. Mental illness doesn't go away. It needs serious mental treatment. So why believe it's a disease? Now here's one reason, is the variety of premorbid personalities of alcoholics is so varied that it's really difficult to imagine that so many people with the many different people would end up with the same moral problem, moral failing, one that manifests in the same way for all of them. Wow, statistically that's kind of incredible that you'd have that many people with the same moral failing. It just doesn't explain the population. As I said, you look like alcoholics and drug addicts to me. I swear to God. All right? And in fact, 65% of you went to work. So this notion that you all had the same moral failing doesn't work with the population. You have to squeeze them into this moral failure box in order to say that. Another reason to believe that it's a disease and a primary disease is the notion of tolerance. Addiction does require tolerance as one of its criteria. In my world, it does. And you can't will yourself into it. In fact, you can't cause it to happen to you. How many people do you know who have been tolerant since their high school days? How many people do you know who were tolerant from the very beginning of their use? Anybody know somebody who's, in high school we said he had a hollow leg? He could take more than everybody else? You knew people like that. You knew people like that. So they didn't sort of drink themselves into tolerance. They seemed to have come with it. Tolerance, as far as I can tell, only happens, I hear addicts say it all the time, only happens 2 ways. One, a percentage will tell you, I didn't become tolerant, I was always tolerant. I could always hold more than anybody else. And the others will tell you, I don't know when it happened. It just sort of seemed that after a while, I could drink more than everybody else and not show the effect. The myth is that it is drinking that causes tolerance, and heavy drinking that causes tolerance. And the truth is it's tolerance that causes heavy drinking. See, if you're tolerant of the drug and you just have 2 of them, you won't feel the effect, all right? So what do? You have to drink more to feel the effect. The more you become tolerant or started out as tolerant, the more you have to keep drinking. Kids will say to me, I'm lucky, I'm tolerant. I'll say, geez, you're not lucky, that's unlucky. All it means to me is that you can kill more brain cells than your buddies because you're tolerant. So you're going to get dumber quicker, that's all. Because you have this unfortunate tolerance for the drug. More myths and attitudes that need to be reshaped. Just the sheer numbers, 10 to 15 million addicts in the United States argues for a disease conception. No other illness happens at that rate. It's the number 1 health problem in the United States. Alcohol and drug abuse and addiction. All right? And you can't insist that they all came down with the same problem at the same time in the same society. That's just incredible. To argue that addiction is a form of mental illness is to argue for what I said a moment ago, spontaneous remission. That a serious mental illness, one that disturbed a human being for many years, managed to disappear without serious psychiatric treatment. What that's hearkening to is the notion that you get 100 alcoholics sober, and there will be a percentage who have a mental illness in addition to alcoholism. But the others are just going to be normal people. Normal people screwed up by drinking, okay, but not diagnosable as bipolar, manic depressive, schizophrenic, serious major disorder, major depressive disorder, etc. They're not diagnosable. Okay. And yet, they've all been through one hell of a life-changing, character-changing, shaping experience. So it has its impact, but they're not diagnosable. The majority are not diagnosable. So they're just not crazy. They're drunk. 2 of the commonest mistakes are that results are causes. And what we do is we see a resultant depression or an anxiety as pre-existing. You cannot look at addiction by looking at a slice of life. Your terribly distorted view of addiction. For instance, if you only look at addicts at end stage, if that's all you see, you're going to think that they're all crazy. Why? Because they look crazy. And it's made them crazy, If you only look at addicts from the Veterans Hospital, that chunk of life, you're going to end up believing that addiction is caused by post-traumatic stress disorder. Because that's what you'll see most of. If you only examine addicts in a psychiatric hospital, guess what you're going to think? They all have an additional psychiatric disorder. So you got to see it not just as a slice of life in a particular place. The best version is the movie version, right? You got to see it over the long haul. You have to see the history of alcoholism. Dr. George Vaillant, Harvard psychiatrist, wrote his book. His main point was just that. You can't take a look at the chunks. You got to take a look at the whole history. And he did. He looked at Boston blue-collar workers and Harvard graduate alcoholics over a period of 50 years. And that was the basis of his book. To me, is the only statistically valid basis for looking at addiction. You've got to see its history. You can't take a look at one chunk of it. So yeah, you see somebody who is in end-stage alcoholism, and he's dangerous and crazy. But that wasn't what he looked like 30 years ago. The best way is the movie version, okay? Go watch movies. In fact, some psychiatrist once said to me, how should I learn addiction? I said, well, you can come to my lectures. And he said, I don't have time to do that. And I said, well, here's a list of 7 movies. go watch them, and then you'll have a better view of the nature, the progressive nature of this. So you don't end up looking at the results of addiction and thinking they were the cause. The patient's depressed. After 30 years of drinking, you'd be depressed too. All right? Get him sober, and he may not have a coexisting depressive disorder. And that hospitalized addicts and alcoholics represent the majority. Or, it's Boston blue-collar workers, or it's Harvard graduate alcoholics. No, look at the grand sweep of things. The simple truth is that alcohol is a drug, and because it is, there are always going to be a percentage of people who are prone and people who are protected, simply because it is a drug. And the truth is, give the same drug to 1,000 people, and you'll get 3 responses. I'll use aspirin. How many of people in this audience, if they take a single aspirin, find that it so irritates the stomach that they don't take aspirin? Anybody in here? It's always a small percentage. So actually, you are actually protected from excessive aspirin use, aren't you? You have a built-in natural protection against excessive aspirin use. There are some people who will find that if they take 2 aspirin, that the 2 aspirin are effective. That'll relieve the pain or the headache. And you might have to repeat the dose once, but sometimes you don't have to repeat the dose at all, or only once. How many people respond favorably to 2 aspirin administered in small doses? Then, how many people in this audience will find that 2 aspirin doesn't work? Just don't work. I can't get any relief from 2 aspirin. That I need to take 3 or more, and may have to repeat the dose more than a few times. Why is that the case? Because aspirin is a drug, and there are varying susceptibilities to the same drug. Some people are protected against excessive aspirin use. For some people, 2 works. Excessive use is irrelevant and unnecessary. And for others, unfortunately, high doses are necessary. Alcohol is a drug. Heroin's a drug. Cocaine's a drug. You know what you're going to find with those drugs? The same things you find with aspirin. If you give the drug to a different people, some will find it unpleasant, so unpleasant an experience that they won't continue it. Some will find that, why do more? 2 works. And some will find 2 doesn't work. I have to take more. I'm tolerant. Okay. Now you add to that the fact that there are also 2 kinds of people in this world who use alcohol. Some people drink alcohol and they like it. Some people drink alcohol and they love it. And some people drink alcohol and they get dizzy, groggy, sleepy, and sick from a low dose. 3 of us used to go drinking in a bar in northeastern Pennsylvania. 2 alcoholics, 1 non-alcoholic. The 2 alcoholics would be there drinking ourselves away, and Buzz, that's his real name, he would have his second beer and fall asleep. We said, Buzz, wake up. He said, okay, I'll wake up. I said, what the hell's wrong with you? We came out here to sing Irish songs and fight if we had to. And he said, I drink alcohol and I just get really sleepy. I just get groggy. Buzz is not alcoholic to this day. The other 2 are. Okay. One's recovering. He just doesn't respond. And it's not personality. I have another friend who is an All-American lacrosse player, has a jaw that looks like iron, whose heroes are John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. If he has 2 beers, he gets groggy. So we ask him, John, what's up? And he said, well, 2's my limit. I don't like it after 2. Some people are prone and some people are protected. From some people for whom it's essential to have more, for other people it's irrelevant to have more. And that's because these are drugs. This is a matter of the proneness of certain brains to drugs, to certain drugs. So the notion that they're bad people or whatever is silly. Okay? There's another attitude that has to be unlearned, and it is that there is an alcoholic personality. So you ask the question, how many of you believe there is an alcoholic personality, or at least have heard that said? If you haven't heard it, you haven't been alive in this goddamn universe, because we've been saying that for years, that there's this alcoholic personality that will predict or cause alcoholism. Okay? That doesn't bear up to research. Dr. George Valiant, Harvard University psychiatrist, does a longitudinal study of 40 to 50 years, and the result of that study had him conclude the following, that the so-called, now he's the guy who has seen the history, right? That's the book, it's a natural history. He's seen the history. He hasn't seen the slice of life. He's seen it walk all the way through from 19 to 50. Okay? He concluded from that study, longitudinal study, that the so-called alcoholic personality wasn't the cause of alcoholism, it was the result of alcoholism. In other words, it's not a personality type that causes excessive drinking, it's excessive drinking that changes personality. So, in my book, I don't refer to an alcoholic personality. I refer to the personality of addiction. In other words, the personality changes that happen as a result of the process called addiction. All right? Because there is no such thing as a pre-morbid, predictive personality. It doesn't exist. That's what data tells us. And yet I still hear people say it all the time. Oh, that's because of his alcoholic personality. You know? Whenever I'm asked, is there such a thing as an alcoholic personality, I put my tongue in my cheek and I say, yeah, but we're not sure whether it's Betty Ford or Anna Nicole Smith. Their personalities are so similar, aren't they? Johnny Cash and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Which one had the alcoholic personality? When you look at the population of addicts, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. They are too different. So, NIDA now defines addiction as a brain disease. The National Institute of Drug Abuse says addiction is a brain disease. And there are a whole number of studies that point to not a personality predilection, but to a biochemical predisposition. Some studies that indicate that it's genetically influenced. No one is studying an alcoholic personality anymore. They're studying dopamine, gene receptors for dopamine. Now, dopamine is the feel-good chemistry. Dopamine is the part of that, is that chemistry that makes your brain go, wee, that's fun, I like that. And that's what they're finding. Nobody's studying other things. They're focusing on biochemical factors, not psychological factors. All right? Nobody's studying the other. If you hear of somebody, let me know about it, because I'm going to go read them. Here's another one that's compelling evidence for the disease notion. If we had a section of the population that would have very strong motivation not to ever want to become an addict themselves, we could tell whether strong motivation to avoid the disease was effective. So let's find ourselves a group of people who never want to end up addicts and alcoholics themselves. And we have such a group. Guess who they are? The children of alcoholics. They say, God, I never want to be one. All right? Why? Because the experience wasn't fun. Being raised by, growing up in the home of an alcoholic. So the question then becomes, is strong motivation to avoid alcoholism have an impact? Does it help people avoid alcoholism? when we look at the children of alcoholics, what we find is that not only does it fail to protect them, they end up with a problem 4 times as often as the rest of the population. So motivation to avoid alcoholism appears in that segment of the population to be just a colossal failure. Again, John's story. When John was 16, his father, an alcoholic, chronic alcoholic, who died of alcoholism on the streets of Baltimore, as a matter of fact. John hated his father so much, he went up to him one day and punched him in the stomach as hard as he could and said, "Why are you doing this to us, you son of a bitch?" And made a vow that he was never going to, be a drinking alcoholic. He started drinking, I think, when he was 23, whatever, not very long. Within 3 years, he went to his first AA meeting. Because he drank alcohol, and he said, "No wonder my father loved this stuff. This is wonderful stuff." Some people respond to it that way. That's one of the hardest things for non-alcoholics to appreciate. They don't get what the addict gets from the experience of intoxication. Most non-addicts, they don't get that impact. They don't have that experience. And so it's sort of baffling to them. They wonder, why would anyone want to drink this stuff in that amount? Because they can't and don't want to, and don't feel good when they do. Okay? Non-addicts just don't get it. It's a different experience. It's not the same experience. It's a qualitatively different. And the children of alcoholics prove to us that even though they should be protected, they are prone. And the proneness is not a psychological matter. It's a genetic matter. They end up with a problem an awful lot. How about your attitudes toward AA or NA? AA are not religions. They are spiritual programs. There's a major difference. There are no rules. They say to you, if you want what we have, then you should do what we do. And they talk about a higher power, but that's not a single traditional notion of some spiritual being. You can believe in any higher power you want. So they don't do that. It was developed scientifically. I mean, AA worked very simply. They said, if it works, we'll keep it. If it doesn't work, we'll throw it away. And so what they developed from that were the 12 steps. They say, these are the things that have worked for us. So sort of very scientific, If it worked, they kept it. If they didn't, they threw it away. All that you need to know about the higher power is that you're not it. That's all. You're not it. If you think you are it, then, God, I got to meet you. You must be something. The 12 steps are what the recovery program's about. It says, here's what we did. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and they said, you do these things, you're doing what we did. It's as simple as that. It's not magic. It's a simple, pragmatic approach to what kept the first 100 sober. And the steps themselves are a combination of common sense. No one solves a problem he doesn't have. Step 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Sound mental health, we straightened out the damage that we did in the past. So they made a list of all people that they had harmed and made a decision to make amends to them. And then some spiritual and rather Eastern kind of stuff. Like came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That's fairly Eastern, because the Western mind says, okay, tell me what it is. And all AA will tell you is that we just came to believe this. How did you do that? We just came to believe that. We sort of hang around long enough, and gradually something started to change. Okay. So there's some Eastern, non-Western, how do you control the problem? The Western mind says, grab it and choke it to death. And the Easterner says, get out of its way. Step aside. Let it use its energy against itself. You know, American boxing is oppositional. Forms of karate, etc., are not oppositional. They'll step out of your way and let your force, use your force against you. So, you know, the Western mind, how many of you are sailors? Anybody sail? A boat sail? If you're a novice and you're sailing along and the wind comes broadside and starts to tilt you over, intuition tells you to grab that sail and hold on tight, right? That's the Western approach. A seasoned sailor watching you pull that rope and hold on tight will tell you what? Let go. They'll say, let go. So, in fact, what you find if you are a sailor is the more you struggle with that and hold it tight, the more the boat's going to go over. That if, in fact, you let go, the sail will kick out and move you in the direction of the wind that it must in order for you to sail. Then you grab it. A drowning man thinks the way you survive is by struggling, kicking, shoving, screaming. If all you do is stop, the body has a natural float response, doesn't it? If all you do is stop, what will happen? You'll float to the top. And you can take a bite of air and a couple of little doggy paddle strokes and take another bite of air. So it's this interesting combination, common sense, good old-fashioned mental health stuff, and there's some of this other stuff. It's a little bit unlike most Westerners think about. Kind of interesting. It's been these 12 steps have been compared to other spiritual programs. But guess what? Attitudes can and do change. So if you say you have an attitude toward whatever, what you have to realize that it didn't take long for that to go to that. Come on. Attitudes change. Attitudes are not foisted on you. If you think so, ask Anthony Robies. He won the NCAA championship in wrestling at 125 pounds about 3 years ago. He was born with one leg. So he'd have to be miserable. He'd have to be self-pitying. He'd have to spend the rest of his life sad and lonely. Not Anthony Robies. If you think situations create attitudes, you have to meet O.J. Brigance of the Baltimore Ravens, who deals with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. You know, if you think attitudes are foisted on you because of mental illness, you have to meet John Forbes Nash of Princeton University, professor there, and schizophrenic, and also winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. How many of you have seen A Beautiful Mind, that movie? Amazing movie. Amazing movie. If you think situations create attitudes, ask Amy Purdy, who doesn't have feet. Ask Heather Mills, who doesn't have legs. If you think situations create attitudes, you got to meet Ray Charles. You got to meet Ronnie Millsap. You got to meet Stevie Wonder. Blind musicians. If you think that, deafness creates attitudes, ask Pete Seeger. Wish he were still around, ask Ludwig van Beethoven. If you think situations create attitudes, ask 7-year-old Jane Richards, who lost both her brother and her leg at the Boston Marathon a year ago. And today she dances on that thing. Ask that Vietnam vet who walks on a pole. Even without control over where we are still in control of how we are where we are. So, prison doesn't necessarily have to make you miserable. And the best illustration of that is a fellow named Robert Stroud. Stroud was a murderer. He was imprisoned at Leavenworth and denied parole dozens of times. He was a lifer, imprisoned at 19, and spent 64 years in prison for a crime that he did when he was 19. You would think he'd have to be pretty miserable human being. So how did he deal with life in prison at both Leavenworth and Alcatraz? Well, his nickname will shed light. Robert Stroud is the Birdman of Alcatraz. He wasn't free about whether he was in prison. He was free about how he was in prison. So even when you're not in control of where you are or what affliction you're dealing with, attitudes are always a choice. Always a choice. Once you realize my attitude is my choice, then you're really free. Because they can't imprison you. Even if they imprison you. And that's a shift of thinking. That's the kind of change that can happen in a spiritual program. If your focus is a spiritual awakening. And hell, why did AA work? Because it put together the right ingredients. That's why it worked. I mean, hell, if all AA ever did was promise abstinence, it wouldn't have lasted more than 6 months with alcoholics. They just said, is this it? We get to be sober? And shit, drinking is more fun than that. They must have benefited somehow. The benefit must be powerful, that it would overpower their attraction for a love object. They had to have something going for them. When I heard it, I thought, I got to find out about this group, This is amazing. People who love a drug and they get them to stop it and have a good time anyway. Damn, I have to find out about those folks. You think of the most horrible situation that life has to offer, it still doesn't force attitudes. So, there you go. Attitudes, important in all kinds of ways. Learning about addiction, recovering from it for families and addicts themselves.